target. But I think Pragg has this big card in his hand, which is that he can go b4 at the right time, and so he goes rook h2 and reaches his 40th move. Now a good idea is to wait with rook h8 or something, but 43 seconds and David is thinking he has 17 seconds now, last move, and they'll get 30 extra minutes on the clock. What does he do? Oh, he blunders with knight g5, but will Praggnanandhaa spot it? Pragg comes back to the board, pauses a bit. He now has 30 minutes left, and he's like, is this really happened? Why is this a blunder now, guys? Think. Not because Pragg can take this pawn. David has seen it, because after take, this pawn is hanging. So that is not the issue here. The main issue now is actually that Pragg can win a pawn in spectacular fashion by taking here. But you might think, isn't the knight protecting this pawn? Well, now, of course, you can't take this because king g7, he attacks your rook. So that is not working. But rook f2, and if the king moves away, then knight takes e5. But he can block here, and knight d2, and you gain back material. Will Praggnanandhaa find it? Oh, he finds it. He finds knight takes e5. It's a great sacrifice here, and you can see David Navara comes back in his chair, and I am sure he sees it. It's a big shock to him. Pragg knows. He thought for roughly 12 minutes, but he knows that now the game is really better for him. It's almost in the bag for him. Knight takes on e5. So a tactical blunder by David Navara. And now rook f2 check. Yes, he finds it. So clearly you can't move the king, because then you lose the piece and there's no compensation for you. So you have to play knight ef3. You could also play this knight, but then I can just take, and you cannot take back because it's pinned. So that would be lost. So you play the other knight to f3. That's what you want to do. Yes, you place it on f3. And now, not to take this rook takes f3 and get into a lost position, but knight d2. And the problem for black is that there's no way that this pin can be broken, and Pragg has seen it, that he is now a pawn up in the rook endgame. And not only that, he has a great structure, he has everything going for him. For David Navara, this is now again a very tough defensive position that he has to assume, but it's not even that he can defend it. This one is now just practically lost. Rook g8, and now it's a natural recapture, but you can see that how Pragg actually takes more than 5 minutes for this move. He's thinking ahead. He's thinking ahead here. Knight takes f3. Most likely Navara has to take on f3, because if the knights are on the board, that would be an advantage to white. So he takes. And rook endgames are very notorious for being drawish in nature. You know, many times you play rook endgames, one pawn advantage is not good enough. But here, Praggnanandhaa has not just a pawn up position, but he's saying that e6 is weak, h6 is weak. He takes with the rook. He could have taken with the king as well. He gives a check. And then now king goes maybe to e7. That seems like a defensive idea, king e7. But David goes active with king g5. Whoa. This was a little unexpected. But now there's an idea that Pragg has. He can go back rook f1. And the point is, if you take king takes g4, rook g1 check, and you lose the rook. And if you move your rook away, let's say rook b8 with the idea of b5, I can go rook h1 with the idea of rook h5 to take this. But Pragg decides to go more active. He goes rook f7 and he attacks the c7 pawn. Now, for David Navara here, this is interesting moment. Should he indulge in a race here, which is very sharp race, king g4, rook c7, h5, and start pushing his pawn? He decides that he'll do so, but first he wanted to save his c pawn. So he pushes it to c5. Maybe not the best of ideas, but it is still a complex position that Pragg has to convert. And with 8 minutes left on the clock, it's never easy. Pragg goes rook to b7. Now let's calculate. He must take king g4. Pragg takes on b6. That happens. King g4 has happened. You take the pawn on b6 as Pragg. That is also done. Now, two things. Either you can defend this pawn, but then Pragg would anyway start making progress. Like if you go here, he goes d4 and he just starts pushing his pawn. So time is of the essence, and that's what David does. He pushes his h pawn and he wants to queen it. He wants to push here. But then Praggnanandhaa may have to sacrifice his rook for one full rook for the pawn on h pawn. So rook takes e6, and I think you need to push as David here. Yes, he does h4, and Pragg can actually place his rook behind the pawn, which is generally a very good advice in rook endgames. Always place your rooks behind passed pawns. It doesn't matter if it's your passed pawn or your opponent's. What is more important is that you place it behind the pawn. Now h3 is very likely, and then David has a small trap. If Pragg goes d4, it just loses his advantage, because after take he has this classy move rook b8. And here the point is that after e5 you have this move king g5. Take, there's rook b3, and if you go rook h7, I just keep moving back and forth, and this is a draw. But Pragg does not fall for it. He pushes his pawn to e5, not d4. That's very important. He's seen it. And now rook b8 once again. Don't go d4. d4 is the mistake. Praggnanandhaa must improve his king up the board. But you know, it's so tempting to push your pawn. And I'm sure that Pragg, under time pressure, is definitely feeling the heat, but he finds king e4. Such accuracy in the end game. This is just high class, high level play by Praggnanandhaa. And David Navara now under a lot of pressure in order to find counterplay. He came up with some great ideas. He came up with his counterplay. He takes the pawn on d2, but maybe now it's really time to push the pawn to d4. But even more strong than that is to push your e pawn down the board, because even if you give a check, my king is going up ahead. So definitely e6 on the cards, but Pragg has only 2 minutes left to figure out what to do, and he is deciding to go e6. Yes, he pushes e6, another strong move. With one logical move after another, Pragg has built up a completely winning advantage. Check to the rook on e2, king d5 played. And now the point is the king is much more active. So even though if black goes h2, I would go d4 and connect my pawns. So David goes rook e3, attacking the d3 pawn. So push the pawn. Yes, he pushes his pawn to d4. Very logical, because now if you take cd, I will take back, and if you play rook takes c3, there is d takes c5. He takes it, and now d takes c5 is the natural move, because with this you have, okay, your pawns are no longer connected, but that doesn't matter, because both the pawns are too strong. This pawn is going ahead, this pawn is also going ahead, this pawn is not going anywhere. So Pragg is completely winning. Rook d3 check played by David. Well, king goes back to c4. That seems very likely. Yeah, Pragg goes for it, king c4. And now he has 2 pawns to push. Where does David go? He is down to his last few seconds. He knows that the writing is on the wall. He goes rook e3, but this pawn is anyway protected, and now Pragg can go c6. He can push his pawn. Yes, he pushes his pawn down the board, and even a distracting move like h2 makes no sense here, because after I take, rook takes, my king is closer, and I just win with the extra pawn. So c6 played, and now what is David going to do here? He could resign the game, but also maybe it's time for one final couple of moves. He goes king g5, attacking the rook, and the rook needs to move. But Pragg may also decide to push his pawn and make a queen. Yes, he pushes the pawn. Fantastic chess by Praggnanandhaa. And now you can't stop the pawn. And he goes rook e1. Last trap, if you make a queen here, the problem is there's a check and you lose the queen. So Pragg actually first takes on h3, and his point is if you give a check, he will block it with his rook. So this is now game over. If you take here, I'm making a queen, and Pragg knows that it's done. David Navara also knows that it's done. Praggnanandhaa is going to get a 1 point lead in this mini match going into the second game today. On the next day, he pauses the clock, gets up, shakes hands with his opponent, places the king. The ever so kind and gentle David Navara resigns.